Hey friends, George Kors here, and today I have a very special episode for you. Something that is very important to me as a member of the literary society, that big abstract community that we all belong to, of individuals who engage in the art of literature. We see all the time, I've done videos on these huge book lists, definitive book lists. We see referenced all the time on socials, all over Reddit, all over various scholarly articles, something called the Western Canon. And today I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about, I'll say it up front, it's going to frustrate a lot of you, why I reject the idea of canon. And I have a lot to go through today on that. So buckle up. If you love the canon, I'm here to challenge you today. And I say that with love in my heart. Before we get too deep, if you like my videos and if you want to support me as a writer, you need to do one thing. Go out and buy Always the Wanderer, my debut novel. Please buy this. Buy it for your friends. Buy it for your family. The best way to support me is buying this book. Buy it, give it away, share it. Do that. All right? I appreciate that. That helps me exist. Unfortunately, we got to do that. So if you're subscribed, go ahead and buy a copy of Always the Wanderer right now. If you already have one, buy another one and give it to a friend. So let's talk about this large interconnected idea of the Western canon as posited by Harold Bloom. Why did I get here? Why is it important that I'm making a video about it? What does it have to do with these book lists? I have linked down below all sorts of videos that I've done on different book lists. The New York Times book list, the best 100 books of the 21st century, the New York Times Readers List of the 21st century, the Spiegel list, the Internet's best books. All of these are expressions of the concept of canon. These are individuals, be they professional literary critics or not, attempting to create a list of important works that must be read, for it says hello, that must be read by other individuals. And this is a concept that was developed by a very prominent literary critic named Harold Bloom in the 1990s. Most of his career as a literary critic, his chief work is this Western canon, this notion of Western canon. And I've seen time and again in my short time on socials, all over these socials, I see this question posed time and again: what should I do to become a serious reader? Now, I've already done a video on this, but one of the most common responses that I see are individuals on the internet pointing to Bloom's Western canon. Hey, go read Bloom's Western canon, start there. There's a list. And the list of Bloom's Western canon is really important because that connects us to this New York Times list, connects us to all of these other lists that we see created time and time again. These are expressions of canonization. These are expressions of the will to create canon. And Bloom created this notion of canon in his scholarly work as a literary critic. The Western canon, his sort of summation of a lot of his scholarly work in his career. This came out in 1994. And if you go through the previous videos that I have on lists, on the New York Times list, the Internet's best books, one of the questions that I posit time and time again is, how are we using these lists? What is it that we're using them for? Are we using them to enshrine these works? Are we using them to promote them? Is this paid promotion? Are we using them to encourage people to find these books? Is it pure advertisement? What is it? And this is sort of a philosophical question that I pose to you. And one of the reasons behind it, that even the Internet's best 100 books, and you know, you can at me in the comments about this. All of this is with corporate interest. Even the book list that's the best books of the internet. This is an amalgamation of different corporate lists, or different sponsored lists. And at the end of the day, we need to seriously consider why we're creating these lists? What's the reason? And my rejection of the Western canon, and my rejection in large part of a lot of these lists that you see on my channel and others, is based on the premise of the Western canon. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of this. And I know that this is probably frustrating for folks because the Western canon that Bloom published is a very significant reference work. And you might be sitting there wondering, saying, am I discouraging you from using it as reference work? And I'm going to say not necessarily, but probably yes. Let's first talk about what got me to why I'm making this video. Why did I get here? The answer is pretty simple. I was reading through a collection of interviews that I have from the Paris Review that a good friend of mine years ago got me this set. Thank you, Zach Looney. And, every once in a while I just peek through it and take a look at, what these various critics and authors and poets had to say in the Paris Review. I like the interviews. And I was reading through Bloom's interview. And Bloom had something to say that made me consider creating this video here. And I'll read it to you. I'll read a little bit of it. The interviewer asks, what do you make of all this recent talk of the canonical problem, referring to the Western canon? Bloom responds, it is no more than a reflection of the current academic and social politics in the United States. The old test for what makes a work canonical is if it has engendered strong readings that come after it, whether as overt interpretations or implicitly interpretive forms. There's no way the gender and power boys and girls or the new historicists or any of the current set are going to give us new canonical works, any more than all the agitation of feminist writing or nowadays what seem to be called African American writing is going to give us canonical work. Alice Walker is not going to be a canonical poet no matter how many lemmings stand forth and proclaim her sublimity. It really does seem to me a kind of bogus issue. I am more and more certain that a great deal of what now passes for literary study of the so-called politically correct variety will wash aside. It is a ripple. I give it 5 years. I have seen many fashions come and go since I first took up literary study. After 40 years, one begins to be able to distinguish an ephemeral surface ripple from a deeper current of authentic change. And what Bloom is getting at here, his tone, his willful dismissal of philosophy, kind of made me perk up and say, well, maybe it's time that we talked about this a little bit more seriously. Because a reliance on Bloom, when Bloom is a thinker, if we're positing Bloom as a literary critic, if he is so glib in his dismissal of not only philosophy but different artistic movements, seems to me something that we should probably reckon with more widely. Now, I'm going to say this right now, we're a little bit into the video. This has been done. Other scholars have come out against Bloom's notion of Western canon and were arguing with Bloom at that time. So nothing that I'm doing is new. I'm just trying to recenter that in our present day conversation of literature, because perhaps it's worthy of mentioning again. Now, I went and got my copy of the Western canon, and I was reading through it, and I wanted to find a good, succinct summation that I could read for folks on the channel, just to give you an idea of what Bloom is saying about the Western canon and what the Western canon is. So allow me, if you have the Western canon, I'm going to read starting on page 19 over to page 20. And Bloom in this passage is referring to his concept of the Western canon. But at some point, this consciousness was linked to the idea of a secular canonicity, so that not the hero being celebrated, but the celebration itself was hailed as immortal. The secular canon, with the word meaning a catalog of approved authors, does not actually begin until the middle of the 18th century, during the literary period of sensibility, sentimentality, and the sublime. The odes of William Collins trace the sublime canon and sensibility's heroic precursors from the ancient Greeks through Milton and are among the earliest poems in English written to propound a secular tradition of canonicity. The canon, a word religious in its origins, has become a choice among texts struggling with one another for survival, whether you interpret the choice as being made by the dominant social groups, institutions of education, traditions of criticism, or, as I do, by late-coming authors. This is important. By late-coming authors who feel themselves chosen by a particular ancestral figures. Some recent partisans of what regards itself as academic radicalism go so far as to suggest that works join the canon because of successful advertising and propaganda campaigns. Also important. The compeers of these skeptics sometimes go further and question even Shakespeare, whose eminence seems to them something of an imposition. If you worship the composite god of historical process, you are fated to deny Shakespeare his palpable aesthetic supremacy, the really scandalous originality of his plays. Originality becomes a literary equivalent of such terms as individual enterprise, self-reliance, and competition, which do not gladden the hearts of feminists, Afrocentrists, Marxists, Foucault-inspired new historicists, deconstructors, all of whom I have described as members of the school of resentment. Now, I know in reading these two passages that the alarm bells are probably going off for a lot of individuals right now. The way that Bloom talks about his alleged school of resentment is a wide-reaching dismissal of not only cultural movements and art movements that are important to various communities, the African-American community, right, the black community as one that he points out, but also a dismissal of various philosophical movements and philosophical thinkings. So individuals who develop feminist philosophy and thinking, or even folks who love Foucault and thinking about power and authority. All of this is rejected by Bloom in favor of some magical thinking. And I'm going to read this little portion here again to sort of make clear, to my mind, what Bloom is kind of alleging here. He's willing to part with the importance of all kinds of different artistic movements, and he's willing to impart with all sorts of different philosophies in order to establish some magical thinking. Late-coming authors who feel themselves chosen by particular ancestral figures. This is key here. What Bloom is alleging is that you, the novelist, me, the novelist out there, the poet out there, the playwright out there, perhaps by extension, the musician out there, feels compelled by tradition in such a manner that they feel chosen to carry on this tradition. And by carrying on that tradition, they enter into this cosmological canon. Now, if you, like me, are an individual who has written a novel, or you have created some art out there, you might understand what all is going into the creation of that piece of work. And let me just be clear here. Yes, artists are aware of tradition. They are aware of context. They are aware of the situation in which they are in. And yes, some situate themselves within that tradition very intentionally. But this is not the main crux of their creation, nor is this the main aim of their creation, nor is that the main feeling of their creation. When we're responding with art to society, to our own experiences, to the experiences of those around us, to the philosophies that we think about, of course, tradition is a part of it. But to put this belonging to tradition on such a pedestal so as to dismiss so much of what is relevant in terms of our context as artists. That, to me, that kind of magical thinking that Bloom is engaging here is wild. It's very wild. But now we have heard from Bloom. Allow me to unpack why I reject this. Outside of Bloom's magical thinking, which, you know, I hope to see in the comments folks who disagree with me on that. But why is the broader idea of the canon a problem? And why do I reject it outright? First and foremost is this notion of tradition in the artist. You know, I really have trouble thinking about how ubiquitously the best artists are the ones who are adhering the best to tradition, or the ones who feel themselves specially picked out by some mystical ancestor. This is a really weird sort of projection that I think Bloom is doing here, where maybe Bloom feels like he was part of this larger literary tradition. He feels like maybe he was chosen by some ancestral figure, so he's projecting that onto other individuals. That's the best way I can make out of this, because I cannot really envision, you know, in all my chats with all the novelists and poets and musicians and painters that I know, I really cannot envision one who's sitting there saying, yes, I'm doing this because James Joyce did it, and you know what? I need to continue James Joyce's tradition or else. Seems a little funky. I mean, of course, I've heard countless folks, oh, I love James Joyce. Oh, I love Toni Morrison. That's an inspiration, of course. But to say these figures who are no longer here picked me, of all of us. Strange. Strange thinking. Magical thinking, to my taste. Moving on from that, the Western canon and its concept, and I have to sort of clarify something I said earlier here. Bloom invented this notion of Western canon. Now, I know a lot of folks are going to say, no, George, the canon has been around for a long time. And that is actually part of Bloom's central claim, is that the canon has been this historical tradition through time. And the canon comes from religious thinking, specifically Catholic religious thinking, and is a much earlier phrase. But this iteration of canon was invented by Bloom. This is his original expression of canon, okay? He is rethinking and reapplying that here, and he is shaping that Western canon. He did that, okay? And I have not seen anybody, even Bloom himself and all of his examples and all of his thinking and writing in the Western canon himself, provide a convincing argument that this is anything other than just a speculative, theory created by Bloom himself, okay? And what is the problem with creating that? What's the problem with the New York Times putting out a 100 best book list, or the Spiegel putting out a 100 best books list? And one of the fundamental problems of this is hierarchy. I reject that sense of hierarchy. Hierarchy is intended to create power. And by creating that hierarchy, by saying these are the best, and ignoring whatever else is out there, without the self-awareness that everything else is out there, which is what's going on largely in the Western canon and in many, many of these lists, all of these lists possibly, there is not that self-awareness that this overpopulation of works is actually a good thing for us. Bloom, even in the Western canon, talks about how overpopulation of art is a bad thing. You don't get to experience all the art because there's too much of it, and that's bad. His perspective is skewed, and to my taste, it's wrong. Having an overpopulation of art is a good thing. That means that you can experience a rich amount of art in your life, guaranteed. It also means that you can likely experience a rich amount of art in your own community. That those individuals in your own community who create their own art, if we divorce ourselves from a reliance on corporations, then we are able to say, wow, I read this novel from this guy in my neighborhood. It's so cool. There's so much going on. And you know the artist. However, the Western canon, Bloom's notion of Western canon and these book lists, they create hierarchy. And those hierarchies create power. This is why at the beginning of the video, I'm talking about corporate sensibility here. This is really important to remember. Now, let's take a look at Bloom's Western Canon, though. You folks can go watch my videos on all those book lists, but let's take a look at the Western Canon, the origin of this, and let's go to Appendix C, the Democratic Age. And I just want to note out here, and this is where a lot of the different criticisms of Bloom came at his time when he was alive. Bloom died in 2019, but also have been ongoing since. And this is really important to point out here. You guys can see on this page that we've got Italy, we've got Spain and Portugal, France, all listed right here. And when I, turn the page, I do not see any works from anywhere besides the United States or Europe. So this Eurocentric view all of a sudden becomes very clear. Well, let's move over to Appendix D, the Chaotic Age. This is the portion of the canon that Bloom is least confident in. And if I keep going all the way through here, I see many more languages. I see many more places represented. But what I'm noticing is this is not a global survey. And now folks are going to say, I know you're watching this right now and you're saying this is the Western canon. Well, unfortunately for us, the Western canon still is including items that, are so deeply Eurocentric. And, when I look through here, I do see, items in Hebrew, items in Arabic, items from the West Indies. We even see one of the most notorious faux pas possible, the works of Africa. Without recognizing, that this notion of Western canon, if we're talking about the best works that humanity has to offer, then the notion of Western can't probably be involved. Because if you are just going to group together a gigantic continent like Africa and say, look, here's 10 works, they're great. But at the same time, a small country like Portugal gets many, many, many. We see the problem here. We see the problem developing. And Bloom was criticized in this manner at that time. When this came out, there were plenty of philosophers who were talking about this. And there were plenty of philosophers who were rejecting that hierarchy. Feminists, of course, are absolutely rejecting this notion of hierarchy. And critical feminism is going to lead us to an understanding of why we can have really contextual and great art. Bloom's not there. Bloom's list feels reductive. And when we look through the appendices, which is probably what most individuals are doing when they are buying this book, is that they are flipping immediately to the different appendices. When we look through those, we may as well be looking at a Wikipedia list. We may as well be looking at some other amalgamation, a New York Times list, something like that. What's unique about Bloom's is that first, he does it in the guise of scholarship. And second, it's his notion. So he's the one who created this idea. He's the one who originated it. So we're referring to the sort of source material here. This hierarchy, the power granted through this hierarchy, to my mind, in our society, is largely propagandic. I do agree with Bloom's own self-assessment of the criticism. It is largely propagandic. It is largely based on capitalism, largely based on what sells. That's a problem for me. And that outright is a reason for me to reject it. But I have more reason to reject. So let's keep going. Let's talk about this notion of overpopulation again. And let's talk about that in terms of power. Our individual communities, when we have our own individual literary communities, or we have our own physical realized communities here, or physical literary communities, or digital literary communities, those are places that are going to provide us with more work that we can engage with. And At the same time, we're presented by this large top 5 publisher system that presents us with these very uniform, shiny pieces that we should be buying. Now, the give and take there, frankly, is pretty difficult for us to navigate because every bookstore we go into, we are seeing those major published works, seeing them time and time again. And if you're in a city like I live in the District of Columbia, you might see a lot of independent bookstores here. And the hope would be that those independent bookstores are embracing the literary community here. But they aren't. None of the bookstores here are selling zines. None of the bookstores here are selling local authors. They're not selling independent publishers. And why is that? Why do they get to call themselves independent bookstore if they're not supporting independent authors? The problem here is that they are embracing Bloom's ideology here a little bit. They're saying this overpopulation is bad. And as a business, it's difficult for me to order books from an independent press. It's difficult for me to stock books from the local individuals who are self-published or to stock zines from the local organizations who make them. That's difficult for me. So I will sign a contract with the bigger publishers. That makes it easier for me to keep my shelves stocked. That makes it easier for me to host these book events. Makes it easier for me to be that location in my neighborhood that sells books. Again, we're coming to this bristling against overpopulation of art because of capitalism, because of some obsession with selling, of course, goes without saying, and also we're sort of establishing some hegemonic tendencies here. And Bloom and his Western Canon and your local independent bookstore / Barnes & Noble impersonator who signs, who primarily sells top 5 publisher books, both of those entities are establishing like a hegemonic culture. And as critical readers, as members of a literary community, what we have to ask ourselves is, are we okay with that? Is that something that we're cool with? And if you are, that's on you. That by all means, live your life. For me, I'm curious. I want to know what the local self-published folks are writing. I want to know what the zine kids are writing. I want to know what they have to say. And that work is really provocative and interesting to me. Some self-published person in my neighborhood or in your neighborhood, you watching this, that self-published person probably doesn't have the privilege economically of having an agent. They probably don't have the privilege of having an editor. So what they do in their novel might be really provocative, and it might be something that Bloom lusts after time and time again. Very original. I don't know. I think that's something that as readers and members of the literary community, we have to really reflect on. Are we comfortable giving in to this homogenized corporate structure and hoping that structure is not racist and hoping that structure is not homophobic and sexist and transphobic and ceding the control over whether or not that structure is to somebody else? That's a significant risk and gamble, in my opinion. And this brings me to the last reason why I reject the Western canon. And this is a little bit of my own philosophizing here. My theory about art is kind of twofold. Talent is ubiquitous, as in talent is widely seen. It's all over the place. No matter the community you go to, you're going to find somebody talented in art. Probably even in your dying small town out in the middle of nowhere, you're going to find somebody who's a great painter, find somebody who's a great poet, find somebody who's a great musician. That's my bet. Okay? Talent is ubiquitous. And talent is contextual. So Shakespeare is a big example for Bloom. The context of Shakespeare, his works have been so just mega popular for centuries. Of course, there is ample reference to this work. Goes without saying. That's the context. If I'm a literary person in my own community, my own context might be that I'm curious about my own community. In that case, I'm looking for the literary talent where I find it here. And now I think some of my detractors who are watching this are going to say, okay, well, I've watched your videos and I haven't noticed you highlight any local DC folks. Plenty of time yet to come. It's on my list. And this is part of my goal, is to get there to a place where I'm interviewing these individuals. And hold me to that. We need to be holding each other accountable. If you want a certain kind of content, I want you to tell me that. And if you don't think that I'm, plotting who can I talk to, what, self-published and indie published individuals can I talk to, I am, and I'm talking to them and I'm trying to get them on this channel. That context, first off, recognizing the ubiquity and then recognizing that we create our own context. This is liberation for our literary folks, for our art folks. It's time for us to recognize and move on from this insane reliance on corporate structures and to start embracing a lot more what's around us. I think it's a great thing that what we read right now and what is read in 50 years are different. I think it's great that what we're reading right now is not what they were reading in 1975. I think that's wonderful. That's unique. That's beautiful. Do I think that we will be reading some of the same stuff in 2050? Of course, that goes without saying. We were reading some of the same stuff in 1975. That overpopulation presents us a chance for us to forge our own path. And before you say, build my own canon, the term canon has so much baggage. Let's refer again to what Bloom calls the school of resentment. African American studies, Marxist studies, New Historicism, feminists, post-structuralists. These are so many modes of thinking. Individuals who do not agree explicitly on what art should look like, what good art is, what constitutes good art, what constitutes ethical and moral life. The amount of thinkers that Bloom is willing to dismiss is so significant that I don't think, personally, I'm comfortable saying I have my own personal canon. I'm sure I have novels that I love, poems that I love. Goes without saying. But am I going to start preaching an individualist canon? Absolutely not, because the Western canon is predicated on an anti-intellectual premise to start with, which is rejecting all kinds of thinking. We're not seeing Bloom as some radical feminist thinker who's out there engaging in discourse with somebody like Audre Lorde or Maria Lugones or Gloria Anzaldúa. He's not on the stage with Michel Foucault or Noam Chomsky or Derrida or Lacan. That's not what this is. The Western canon is a work of literary criticism, and literary criticism is definitely next door neighbors to philosophy. Been through a graduate program, I can confirm that. But it doesn't live in the same house. And to reject outright the thinking of all those individuals in the way that Bloom does makes the term canon untenable for me. And I'll take it even further. The term canon, if we recognize it in origin being used by the Roman Catholic Church, has those connotations of hierarchical power from the Catholic Church, and that also makes me uncomfortable. And maybe it makes you uncomfortable. I don't know. Maybe you like it. Maybe you want that. To me, the Western canon and the utility of this book is interesting. The utility of these book lists that we see the New York Times make, Der Spiegel make, it's interesting. These are interesting anthropological objects that reflect ideas in a society. Do I like looking at them? Frankly, yes. I like looking at them as a little sociological peek into what are these individuals thinking. Are they terribly predictable? Yes, absolutely. Can they be helpful for you? Possibly. Possibly. I think when we are theorizing a literary community, we're theorizing a place where we're referencing texts all the time, our own, other people's, so on and so forth. And influence is a big part of that. Tradition's a big part of that. And I don't think I'm going to deny that. But what I will deny is the inherent power structure that's present within something like this book by Harold Bloom in the Western canon. And what I will deny and reject is the power structure that's present in the New York Times reading list. Look through that New York Times reading list. Tell me, how many self-published authors do you see there? You know, how many independently published authors do you see there? And yet, we live in an era with such a significant amount of publishing happening. So many people publishing. And I know I'm hearing the voices out there. Well, those people who aren't published by corporations are just bad writers. They're not good. I'm hearing literary agents out there saying, well, they're just not as good as everybody else. Maybe. In my experience, that is not so clear cut. And at the end of the day, you know, it is to our context to determine what constitutes good art to us. And if you want to outsource that to a literary agent or to a corporation, you're welcome to. By all means. Plenty of people do it all the time. Will I do that? Absolutely not. I think, you know, it's not, I don't trust it. And while I trust everybody is developing their reading practice and executing their reading practice in a meaningful way to them, at the end of the day, an agent and a corporation want to make money. And that's a corrupting factor to me. That's an issue. At the end of the day, I'm really curious as to what you think. I see Bloom's Western canon talked about all the time. Still referenced pretty frequently. And for me, I cannot abide it. I reject it. It doesn't mean that you have to reject it. I'm definitely interested in what you have to say and how you use a book like the Western canon. But to me, you know, Bloom's notion of the school of resentment, this like pejorative dismissal that he is willing to engage with in order to say that Freud and Shakespeare are great, is really bizarre. Because we can say Freud and Shakespeare are great without saying fuck you to all these different thinkers. Seems a little aggressive. Seems unnecessary to me. But it's predicated on hierarchical power. And that is so important to this. If you're okay with hierarchy, you're okay with hierarchy. And I would love for you, if you like and rely on the Western canon, if you rely on this book frequently, and you also reject hierarchy, I would like for you to get in the comments below and tell me how you square that. Because for me, this screams hierarchical thinking. And all those lists, I've got them all down below in my reaction videos. You know, it's fun to react to them. But at the end of the day, that is the creation of hierarchy. For better or for worse. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you're feeling about this. This is a hugely contentious topic. I know I'm probably kicking the hornet's nest here with this. But let's do it. Let's talk it out. I want to thank you for spending some time with me today. It really does mean a lot that you watch these videos. Again, like I said at the beginning of the video, please, we're talking about buying things all day. You want to support an independently published author, do so now with me. Buy my novel, Always the Wanderer. If you want to find out more about me as a thinker, writer, person, in this world, you can visit my website, georgekors.com. You can follow me on socials that I may or may not use at gbk7288. Don't use TikTok anymore. And I hope you're safe. I hope your reading practice is going well. And thank you so much for spending some time with me. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'm curious. Let's have a discourse here, folks. Stay safe, and thank you.